Good evening. I'm Janet Cox. I lead Climate Action California, and I'm really happy to be able to host with our wonderful co-sponsors a really important webinar tonight. Um, Climate Action California, as most of you may know, advocates in Sacramento for the kinds of climate measures that are really going to make a difference. We take science-based positions. We're a whole bunch of wonky volunteers working as hard as we can. And this year, we have been unable to look away from CEQA, and especially from some of the bills that you're about to hear about and that I've been writing to you about, um, that are doing some major damage to what is really California's foundational environmental legislation since 1970. So we're really fortunate to have a great panel to explain all kinds of important things to you tonight. Our co-hosts have been wonderful, supporting this project: Communities for a Better Environment, the Planning and Conservation League, CEQA Works, and the Center for Biological Diversity. We're all in this together. And I'm not going to talk any longer. I'm going to turn this right over to Doug Karstens, who is the board chair for the Planning and Conservation League, and he's really going to run this show. I'm just here to thank you all for coming. So over to Doug, and thanks.
Thank you so much, Janet. And hello, everybody. I'm Doug Karstens, and I'm just really pleased to be here tonight. I wanted to thank Janet and everybody at Climate Action California. Linda, Amanda, Kate, Wendy. Can't see them on our screen, but they're there and have been all along helping to get this together, this webinar this evening, to prepare. I'd like to just take a quick moment to, rather than me introduce Aleha Critcher and David Pettit, ask the two of them to just say hello for a brief moment and then come back to me. I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing tonight. So Aleha, want to say hello?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Aleha Critcher. I'm a legal fellow at Communities for a Better Environment, and we are an environmental justice organization that works out of East Oakland and Richmond in the Bay Area and Southeast LA in Wilmington in Southern California.
Okay, thank you and welcome. And then also David Pettit this evening. David?
Thanks, Doug. Good evening, everyone. I'm David Pettit. I'm a senior attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity. I work on mostly climate-related issues, and that includes a lot of CEQA work. And I'm happy to be talking to you here tonight. Thanks, Doug.
Okay, and thank you, David. Thank you, Aleha, for coming tonight. We'll hear much more from you in just a moment. I'd like to go to the next slide, if we may, to talk just briefly, not a lot of time on the agenda. It's going to be a very packed agenda this evening, just 1.5 hours, but it could go basically all day in some quarters. We'll 1.5 hours. So we'll talk about the context for this. What is CEQA and what does it do? How is it protecting communities and reducing harms? How has it changed over time and the exemptions that have been made? Everybody knows this exemption of SB 131 and 130 and the latest hits that have been taken. We'll talk a little bit about that, or maybe a lot about that. And also talking about countering the anti-CEQA public relations campaign, how we basically are facing that and how we defend CEQA against that, and calls to action, which we'll get to at the end of the evening. As we're going along, we encourage questions. If you place them in the chat, Linda will collate them and pose them to us at the end. We may also basically pick them out as we're going along, but for the bulk, we'll probably answer the questions at the end as we can. We reserve some time for that. So with that, if we go into why we're having this webinar this evening, and that would be on the next slide. We want to put this in context of being CEQA being a Bill of Rights for an environmental democracy. It's a very pithy phrase to capture how CEQA protects the environment and it protects participatory, informed democracy in California. And those two twin goals have been the cornerstones of how CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, has helped and protected the state for so many years. We've seen concerted attacks on CEQA, most recently this summer, but certainly for months and years before that, it's an ongoing battle to hold what we've got and to improve what we've got in terms of the environment. So everybody knew, or I hope has been informed by the, especially Janet's newsletter on the SB AB 131 passage in June 30th, was a huge blow to CEQA. It's not a fatal blow, but like, that knife sticking into the earth is an allegory. It was in the Daily Journal. It's a pretty damaging blow, but we'll talk about that. So CEQA is down, but it's not out, and it needs defense and strengthening and reaffirmance of protection every day and in every way. So if we can turn to the next slide, the attacks on CEQA are something of an echo at the state level of larger forces that are at work. And David, I'd like to turn to you to talk a bit about, I want to ask you about the federal dynamics that you see happening at the kind of national level and federal assaults on the environment generally, or why don't you take it away on what you're seeing nationally first?
Well, let me thank you, Doug, and let me start narrowly with talking about NEPA and then expand a bit to other things that are going on, like the endangerment finding and auto rules and the like that are also happening at the same time. NEPA, as most of you probably know, National Environmental Policy Act, is the federal analog of CEQA, and it's really an informational statute. It doesn't have the sort of sometimes difficult mitigation measure requirements that CEQA does. Anyhow, it's long been a target of developers, and the federal government has pretty much wiped all of the CEQA regulations off the books. There was a recent court case from the DC Circuit that said that the regulations coming from CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality, are invalid. And so many of the federal agencies are now writing their own NEPA regulations, which I'm sure will be very Trumpian, Trump-oriented, and minimize what needs to be reviewed. Just one more thing, and then I'll move on. There was recently a Supreme Court case, the 7 counties versus the Surface Transportation Board, where the court unanimously held that in that case, it involved a railroad that was going to haul petroleum from, I think, somewhere in Colorado or Wyoming to another rail line that was going to refineries, that the EIS there under NEPA did not need to deal with greenhouse gas emissions from the combustion of that oil, even though everyone knew that was the purpose, because those emissions were not within the jurisdiction of the Surface Transportation Board. And that may seem kind of wonky, but to me, it was an announcement that climate change and particularly the evaluation of GHGs is probably not going to be within NEPA in the very near future, if it's still there at all. Stepping up a level, we're seeing a widespread assault on environmental protections. Probably this week, we're going to see an announcement that EPA wants to repeal the endangerment finding. This is the finding that it made after Massachusetts versus EPA, finding that greenhouse gases do in fact endanger the environment. Seems like a kind of no-brainer. But what I think they're going to say is, well, the U.S. contribution, it's a worldwide phenomenon. The U.S. contribution is so small that there's really no redressability, so the hell with it. We don't need this anymore. And that's going to take the legal underpinnings out from a lot of car-related regulations that EPA and NHTSA have been up to in the last few years. In particular, all of the GHG-related regulations that the California Air Resources Board has worked on since 2012, there's a threat that they're all going down the drain because of the endangerment finding and other things the feds are doing. So it's a really bad time in the federal system. in the federal system. And I have to say, it's quite disappointing to see California trying to move in the same direction.
Hmm. And yeah, it sounds like, with the Supreme Court making their decisions, with the Congress the way it is, visiting NEPA and the other environmental laws, and there's the president, that federal, prospects are looking pretty grim. And so a lot of times in the past, we could rely on California, but there's this abundance doctrine, or I want to say a bit about that philosophical, let's say, approach, or what do you know about abundance?
Well, I talked to Ezra Klein on the phone once for an hour. That's about what I know about it. I haven't read the book, but in general, where I think he's going is the idea that, look, we used to build stuff in this country, the interstate highways and dams and railroads and stuff, and we don't build anything anymore. And we need to have a green energy future. We need more renewables. We need transmission lines. We need electric vehicle manufacturing and the like. And these pesky environmental laws, the theory goes, are anachronisms. They're keeping us from doing that. Rather than protecting the environment, they're in the way of a cleaner environment. So they need to go. And I think that's kind of the theory that we're seeing. And one of the questions I think you have to ask in that context is abundance for whom? It's not for the people who live next to these facilities, or who live across the street or across the fence line from power plants, or coal plants in the Midwest and the like. It's not about the income disparities in the United States. It's not about the racial disparities. It's not about any of those social ills that we're seeing, that the xenophobia and the like. And it's the practical effect, I think, will be to enrich a bunch of Silicon Valley types and techno bros at the literally at the expense of everybody else. And unfortunately, this idea has really swept through Sacramento. And this may sound like a joke, but I think that a lot of electeds are afraid of being mocked in the New York Times by Ezra Klein, and they're just all stampeding to be, more abundant than the next guy.
Thank you. I mean, it's a great encapsulation of it, David. A little frightening, but we need to know that and understand that for looking at what's happening in California and the phenomenon of, let me turn the page, to what we saw in the summer in the legislature, which was something of a stampede and a panic. And this is what ended up in SB 131 and 130. If we could go to the next page on the slides, I'll go through really quickly because we're going to come back to this all throughout the evening, where CEQA has been facing a number of exemptions. Some developers call it the Swiss cheese CEQA because there's a hole here, there's a hole there, and they're exempting this. And we'll get to how, a long time ago it started with football stadiums, but now it's almost anything that anybody asks for. And there's what they call streamlining to try to move CEQA more quickly. And the latest and the epitome of, let's say, these horrible and probably the worst environmental legislation in decades has been SB 131. It got shoehorned, and I see it as a little bit of an extortion of the governor using a poison pill approach to saying, if the budget, if these bills are not passed, then the budget's going to go away. A signature on the budget. He linked the budget with some policy changes in SB 131 and 130. And those policy changes, just really quickly, and again, we'll come back to it out the evening, but really damaging, have to do with exempting advanced manufacturing, whatever that means. We'll talk some on that. Exempting what is called near misses. If exemptions don't apply by just one factor, then there's a limited approach on environmental review. There's a bunch of housing exemptions that are new and extensive. The one thing that I think made a difference, or looked to be kind of the end of CEQA, was the end of the fair argument test, which, with all the opposition, got taken out of the bill. So that's a silver lining on some, SB 607 started out as being very damaging. To understand exemptions and fair arguments and all about CEQA, I wonder if Aleja, we might turn to you for an understanding of, say, the basics and how CEQA works. And do you want to take the talking stick for a second, or for a little?
Yeah, happy to. And yeah, I apologize to the people in the audience that have a lot of CEQA experience because I will be going through the basics. But something that I've noticed in my conversations with staffers and even legislators um, speaking about CEQA is that many of the people that are attacking it don't fully understand how it works. So I think to engage in these conversations around CEQA, we have to first go through what it is and how it works. Oh, and you can go to the next slide, please. So very broadly, CEQA, or the California Environmental Quality Act, is a California law that was enacted in 1970. It was created to ensure that state and local governments that make decisions around new projects consider, analyze, and address environmental impacts. You can go to the next slide. So CEQA applies when a public agency makes a decision to carry out or authorize or approve a project that may have a significant impact on the environment. So included in that carry out, authorize, or approve action is building the project themselves, funding a project, issuing a permit, or giving a developer the go-ahead. And so if CEQA applies, the agency is required to study the impact of that project. And sorry, my dog is barking if you can hear her. Inform the public about those projects and limit any damage. And an important note is that what is missing here is anything like if there is a significant impact, CEQA requires that the project be shut down. CEQA has no requirement that projects be shut down. CEQA's ultimate goal is really about information disclosure, transparency, and public participation. You can go to the next slide. So in the CEQA process, what environmental impacts are analyzed? So there are some main areas that are all up on the screen right now, but I wanted to highlight a few of them. I wanted to highlight air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, utilities and service systems, and cumulative impacts. I'm going to talk a little bit about cumulative impacts because it's a really important category for the communities that I work with. And then I'll pass it to Doug to talk about the other ones that we highlighted. So cumulative impacts is the consideration of one factor's contributions to many. It's sort of based on the idea that a factor by itself might not have an impact on the environment, but that when you combine it with other impacts that already exist or will exist in that community, the impact is no longer insignificant. So this category is really important for the communities that we represent because these communities are not just affected by a singular project. In these areas, there are multiple sources of pollution. For example, in Wilmington, you have refineries, oil fields, freeways, the two ports. So a cumulative impacts analysis ensures that all existing pollution is accounted for when considering the overall harm that a given project might have. You can go. Oh, sorry, Doug, go ahead.
Oh, but I mean, Aleja, thanks on the previous slide. Really huge, important point that CEQA does not stop projects. Like you say, there's a possibility of an override. I think it's a technique that is used too much to override significant impacts rather than having to, mitigate them. But that was added by the legislature to specifically address the concern that CEQA is going to stop things or prevent things from being built, or it's just a fact of CEQA that it doesn't necessarily stop even the worst projects if public agencies go and override them. And thank you. On the other areas, everybody can see, there's 18 subject areas that are identified. Cumulative impacts is an important one and probably one of the most important, but it's not even identified as one of the 18 topical areas most EIRs address. They just do it sort of throughout the EIR. We're highlighted the air quality and greenhouse gases because of, I think the audience tonight, Climate Action California, being particularly interested in that. Of course, biological resources, a number of other topic areas are of great significance, but we wanted to focus on these in our examples this evening, a little bit later, to show, CEQA's breadth of coverage, even within these areas. And one bracketed material there in the bottom right, to put in brackets wildfire, it's because everybody recognizes how important dealing with wildfires is, of course. It seems like there's not exactly a designated part of CEQA to do that, except in fire prevention services and utilities, and sometimes you'll see it show up there. But I just wanted to highlight that's one of our major discussion points this evening. So back to you, Aleha, if you wanted to go on with the next part.
Yeah, thank you. You can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so there are a lot of steps in the CEQA process, but I think that we can boil it down to 3 key questions that determine how the process will take shape. So the first question you have to ask is whether the activity is considered a project. Under CEQA, an activity is considered a project if it requires discretionary approval by a public agency that may result in environmental impacts. So basically, a public agency needs to act by giving approval, and then that approval has to be discretionary, which basically means that the agency is engaging in judgment or deliberation when deciding to provide that approval. And then lastly, there needs to be the potential for the project to have environmental impacts. So once you've determined that the project is, or that the activity is a project under CEQA, the next question is whether the project is exempt or exempted from CEQA. And there are many exemptions that currently exist. And as Doug has talked about, and we'll get into a lot later, the attacks on CEQA have largely been to expand these exemptions. So right now, there are 2 main sources for exemptions. So first, you have statutory exemptions, which are the exemptions that were created by the legislature. So if legislators, or as we're seeing with 131, if one legislator determines that a project won't have significant impacts on the environment, they can pass legislation to exempt it from the entire process. On the other hand, you have categorical exemptions, which were created in a regulatory process by the Natural Resources Agency. And in those exemptions, there are 33 classes of projects. And the idea is that these types of projects typically don't significantly impact the environment, so they don't have to go through CEQA. Some examples is the conversion of small structures or the acquisition of housing for housing assistance programs. But I really wanted to highlight that there is also a class for infill development projects. Also important to note is that while a project may fall under a categorical exemption, it can still be subject to CEQA review if certain exceptions apply. So there are exceptions to the exemptions, but for statutory exemptions, on the other hand, they're absolute. So if a project fits into that exemption created by the legislature, there are no exceptions. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so once you've determined that,
Excuse me.
yes.
Alea, can I add one quick thing?
Yes, please.
On your first point, excuse me, as to the distinction between ministerial and discretionary, one thing that's happened a lot recently, particularly with Scott Wiener and the pro-housing folks, is they have figured out that you can just define legislatively a certain type of development as ministerial, and that by itself, just by definition, takes it out of CEQA. So, for example, a lot of affordable housing projects now are ministerial, meaning the local agency has a very small fact-finding job, but no discretion as to anything else about the project, what design, how big it is, the footprint, none of that stuff. They have to approve it. And so that takes those projects out of CEQA entirely just by saying, oh, it's ministerial. And I think we may be seeing more of that.
Yeah, and I'll just add to, we're actually seeing a project in Southgate in Southeast LA that was a former metal recycler that is right next to our communities, our members' homes. And that is being converted into a different project, but it has been determined that it's not a discretionary approval to create this new project, it's ministerial. We can't really figure out why, but so there will not be CEQA review for that new project. So yeah. Okay, so once you've determined that it's a project and it doesn't qualify for an exemption, the next step is determining what kind of CEQA review is required. So first, the agency will conduct an initial study, which is sort of a broad assessment of what impacts the project might have. It'll look at adverse changes in the physical conditions. And then it asks, and Doug sort of talked about this earlier, it asks if there is substantial evidence supporting a fair argument that the project may have significant impacts on the environment. So after that initial study, they asked that question. If the answer is yes, then an environmental impact or an EIR is required. And an EIR is basically, a document that analyzes all the potential impacts and contemplates the best mitigation measures. And it also analyzes alternatives to the project. And then if the answer is no, a negative declaration or a mitigated negative declaration is required. And a negative declaration is a document that states there will not be significant impacts, and a mitigated negative declaration is a document that says there may be significant impacts, but they can and will be mitigated. I don't know if Doug or David, you wanted to add anything, but if not, we can go to the next slide.
Well, yes, Aleha, thank you. Before pivoting, because the next slide is our CEQA protecting communities, I just want to take a couple of quick hits on the answers. Most of the questions we'll answer at the very end, but because one or two of them are covering very specific, one is about light pollution and whether that's covered in an EIR. And the answer is yes, it should be if it's going to create, significant impacts. I want to shout out to, there's a person named Dr. Travis Longcore, who has written on light pollution and its effects on biological resources. So that light pollution is something that should be addressed, not just with regard to biological resources, but also dark skies for human beings. So the answer to the light pollution question is yes, even though it's not a designated area. And then there's also a question about successful cases on cumulative impacts. Certainly there are several, if not many. Many of them are the older ones, but cumulative impacts have been used to set aside analysis, biological resources, for instance, but also warehouses. When I think in the question somebody pointed out, Ontario, there's just one warehouse after another project, millions of square feet approved. And there are some successful cases at the trial court level out there raising some cumulative impact questions. Also, the LAUSD versus City of Los Angeles case about noise pollution and air quality. So answer those two questions and we'll get to others later. So do you want to go back, Aleha, to your your track?
Yeah, thank you, Doug. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. Something I also wanted to talk about was the public input and public participation aspect of CEQA. So this is probably where CBE does most of our work. So our members show up to agency hearings and they give public comment. And so for an EIR, a negative declaration and a mitigated negative declaration, the public can review all of those documents and provide written and oral comments to the decision makers. And so that really provides the opportunity for the people most affected to voice their support or their concern. And so you're seeing with these exemptions, if the project is exempt from the CEQA process, there's no opportunity for community members, for the people who are living next to these facilities to have a seat at the table at all. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we've covered how CEQA works, and now we'll talk a little bit about why it's important. And so what I really wanted to cover is that CEQA protects communities and it allows for deep democracy. CEQA analyzes and mitigates environmental harms. And as we know, environmental harms are not spread evenly along race and class lines. In California, based on redlining and other harmful land use planning, polluting industries are disproportionately located in low-income communities of color. Environmental justice communities experience some of the worst air, soil, and water quality in the country, and will be and are most affected by the devastating impacts of climate change. So CEQA is one of the only tools that these communities have to ensure they have a voice in the land use decisions that will affect them and in the projects that will affect them. And ultimately, if we are to understand democracy, that means everyone has a voice in the decisions that affect them. Through the CEQA process, public comment, public participation are encouraged, right? Like that's part of the CEQA process. And important to note is that there are no citizenship requirements for the CEQA process or the CEQA public participation. Many of our members are undocumented and our communities have been so profoundly affected by these ICE raids without, any process. And throughout CBE's work, we've seen the ways in which CEQA provides the opportunity for our members who live next to the most polluting industries in the country to be able to advocate for their health and their community. regardless of their citizenship. So in that way, CEQA is deep democracy.
Aleha or David? Yeah,
I
David.
just wanted to add one quick thing to that in terms of democracy and being able to comment. One technical thing people should keep in mind is that if you don't comment on an EIR, say a draft EIR, then you can't sue on it later. So it's very important for people who are concerned about a project and may want to have litigation as an option down the road to put their comments into the record. And you can do it by writing a letter and show up at a meeting and talk, whatever it takes, but you need to do that.
And I've seen CEQA just very quickly, or the phrase CEQA is democracy, not just that it promotes democracy or that it helps democracy, but some people have regarded CEQA as democracy itself because of this public participation, the ability to comment. Developers have called it, very cynically, something like a heckler's veto, which seems to me a very, narrow way of looking at people in homes like that. I'm thinking that's probably the Wilmington neighborhood. I'm actually familiar with some areas.
Yeah.
People who are nearby participating in government decisions that you may not even get notice of or an ability to weigh in about. And elected officials don't always and sometimes rarely protect people living in the communities like this. So yes, the democratization of the public decision-making process is so important, and CEQA is strong about that. Okay.
Great, thank you both. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so now I just wanted to give an example of CEQA being used to protect a community. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the 710 freeway expansion project. And I will preface this section with an acknowledgement that most of this happened before my time as a practicing attorney. So Doug and David will definitely have to pitch in with their involvement, but I can speak to CBE and our members' involvement. So for those unfamiliar with LA and our freeways, the 710 freeway has a northern portion in Pasadena and a southern portion that starts in East LA and ends in Long Beach. So there's like a missing gap in between the portions. So this expansion project was being considered after a report came out that the LA and Long Beach ports would be tripling their capacity. So there would be a huge increase of import goods. And to accommodate this, LA Metro adopted a plan to expand the 710 freeway by creating more lanes and also connecting the northern and southern portions, which would displace a lot of people. And the 710 freeway is known for its heavy concentration of diesel truck traffic and air pollution. So it's often referred to as the diesel death zone. So obviously by expanding this already highly polluting freeway, there would be multiple levels of harm. After the draft EIR was released, CBE and our members submitted over 640 community comments through the CEQA process. And those comments were basically advocating for a zero emissions plan and also for a plan that wouldn't displace people. And ultimately, it was determined that the project would pose too big of an air pollution burden in a hotspot air pollution area. And so the project was halted. But yeah, I will let Doug and David chip in if you have anything to add.
I mean, I think that covers it, Aleha, very well. The southern portion tied into the port of Long Beach in Los Angeles. They're adjacent to each other at that point. And the trucks would go up to East Los Angeles. So basically go north from the port and then to the rail yards there. Lots of rail pollution associated with the intermodal transfers, and then out to the rest of the country, because there's so much of the goods movement industry that basically comes through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And with communities like Wilmington, like West Long Beach, like Carson, that are right next to the ports, they are bearing the brunt of that pollution for, basically benefiting the goods movement industry. David, I think there was a role also that NRDC had in some of those battles.
Yeah, NRDC, I used to work there before they let me go because of my poor fashion choices. But they were involved in both the north end and south end of the 710. The south end is the one that would directly serve the ports, And just one thing that's significant from what Alejo said, and I've worked on a lot of Caltrans and federal highway projects, is the hotspot air quality analysis is a feature of federal law. And if a federal project involves federal money, which all highway projects do, pretty much, and the highway builders hate it. They hate this. They don't want to deal with it because it makes them confront in a scientifically rigorous way what kind of air quality effects the EJ communities along the highways are going to see if the highway is built. And they would rather not know that, and rather not be subject to both public scrutiny and any mitigation measures. So when it's very heavy duty consequence for EPA to send a letter saying you guys can't handle this, don't do it. I don't think that would happen under the current administration, but it is a useful tool against new highway construction if you think it's a bad project. And just one last thing here, there's a fact called induced demand, which is like, if you build it, they will come, if you like baseball movies. And it's not just a theory, it's an empirical fact that if you add lanes like to the 405 in the Sepulveda Pass, which happened recently, traffic flow doesn't improve. If anything, it gets worse because more people decide, hey, there's an extra lane, let's go for it. And then the highway just fills up and you're back where you are. And that would have happened to the 710 also.
David, I'm going to give you a more baseball analogy because I worked on, say, the northern 710 part. There's an attorney named Tony Rossman, great attorney, who would describe the plan to extend the 710 all the way to the 10 freeway as the Ebbets Field plan, because it goes back to, say, 1954 when the Dodgers played at Ebbets Field. And so there's this plan that was generated in, say, the 50s that agencies, currently try to implement. And of course, the 50s were a different era. I think the governor's been heard to say, oh, why can't we build things like we did in the 50s and 60s? Well, that's an era when a lot of, let's say, environmental justice communities didn't have a voice at all. You could see things like the Century Freeway getting built, that some communities were just cast aside. For instance, the Chavez Ravine community,
right,
eminent domain to make way for Dodger Stadium or other projects that society saw as necessary, but the communities affected didn't have enough of a voice or means to lift up their voices. That's a phenomenon of infrastructure planning, I think, that is unfortunate. And in Abundance, the book, the authors did quote Governor Newsom as saying, whatever happened to the 50s and 60s, and why can't we do anything like this anymore? Well, that's one of the big reasons, is my view, is California is not what it was or where it was in the 50s and 60s. So shall we turn to a related but different topic, or any more on this question about 710 and infrastructure and protecting communities?
Let me just add, there is a California civil rights statute that I and others have experimented with to try to deal with exactly the phenomenon, Doug, that you're talking about, like the Chavez Ravine phenomenon, or the reason the I-10 in Santa Monica goes through the neighborhood that it does, where you can, unlike in the federal system, you don't need to have direct evidence of discriminatory intent. You can infer it from discriminatory impact or unequal impact, and so that's a tool, a potential tool for people who are going to fight projects that have a fairly obvious racially discriminatory effect, like freeways or, putting all these warehouses in EJ neighborhoods and the like.
Absolutely. I think that's maybe 1135 of the government
code, right.
The civic provision. Okay. Well, thank you, David and Aleja. Shall we turn to the harms that CEQA can prevent or reduce? This would be on the next slide. And one example that I would suggest, come in for people's view is the Newhall Ranch case, which involved a very large development, something like 21,000 units, 60,000 people in northern Los Angeles County. This was about 10 years ago. There was a Supreme Court case where the Center for Biological Diversity and others, Sierra Club, the California Native Plant Society, Wishtoyo Foundation, the Friends of the Santa Clara River, sued the County of Los Angeles in order to ensure that the environmental impact report was adequate under CEQA. The report for that stage happened to be for the interim take permit that was necessary. The three issues in the case had to do with greenhouse gas analysis, the unarmored three-spine stickleback, a threatened endangered species, and consultation with Native Americans. The Wishtoyo community was particularly left out of the process, let's say. So the Supreme Court, in one of the more important parts of its opinion, dealt with how CEQA addresses greenhouse gas impacts and the emissions that would be created by essentially, this was a sprawl development separate from other communities, and how greenhouse gas impacts had to be addressed adequately in CEQA documents. There was a time, and that time was about 2009, when it was not even clear that CEQA would deal with greenhouse gases. And there was some element of the legislature that wanted to make it very clear that CEQA did not include it. And that effort with a bill that was introduced backfired when the rest of the legislature, who happened to be Democrats, passed the bill and said, absolutely, CEQA covers greenhouse gas analysis, and here's how it has to be addressed in EIR. So CEQA has been instrumental in addressing climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. There was a settlement in this Newhall Ranch case, which ended with what has been termed net zero Newhall. I say that with air quotes around it because that's basically the developer's term. It's not net zero, but it's set a standard that the rest of the industry now points to and says, oh, we have EV chargers and we have batteries and we have measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're net zero as well. There's a lot of effort to at least address greenhouse gas emissions through CEQA. I'd like to make that a very quick, unless Aleja or David, you want to talk a little bit more about,
No.
We have another slide that will also get at this, and I wonder if Aleja, that you might want to talk about the Paramount biofuels.
Yeah. Yeah, so this was an expansion of a biofuels conversion project. So this facility used to be a refinery, and it closed in 2011, and then 3 years later, it was converted into a biofuels site, and it was licensed to process up to 3,500 per day of vegetable oils and beef tallow into biodiesel and jet fuel. And so this was approved through an EIR, and some of the environmental burdens that were identified with this project was, the 25,000 barrels of animal fat and vegetable feedstock per day, installing a very long gas pipeline, and then a bunch of truck trips. So they created an EIR. It was Communities for a Better Environment, CBD, and Earth Justice, who sued based on an inadequate EIR, and that included a cumulative impacts analysis. I was an intern at the time, actually, with Earth Justice, so I was involved in this one. So through that lawsuit, we were able to get a lot of really important mitigation measures through the settlement process. And so in some of those harm reductions, we have reductions in VOCs, reductions in diesel vehicle emissions, a commitment to a carbon life cycle analysis, and then a restriction on certain feedstocks. And then it also included a fund for a zero emission vehicle fund for the local community. There's a bunch of other ones, but those are the main ones that I wanted to highlight. So that's just an example of the ways in which the CEQA process can be used to not stop a project, but to really improve it in terms of emissions, and then also the impacts on the local community.
Aleja, this would be a good place to ask if SB 131 was on the book with advanced manufacturing being exempted, what would happen?
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Doug, for that question. Yeah, so with this iteration of SB 131, it's basically exempting advanced manufacturing in areas that are zoned industrial. So this is sort of the perfect sort of example of how that would affect projects going forward. The definition of advanced manufacturing, it's really, really unclear, and it's very broad. And so it would likely be the case that biofuels would count as a project that is an example of advanced manufacturing. And so if SB 131 was passed before the creation of this project, it most certainly would be exempted from CEQA. And so if it were exempted from CEQA, we wouldn't get any of these harm reductions that we saw.
Thank you, Aleja. I mean, that's a measure of the damage that was inflicted by 131. And I think one reason that people are working on that, we'll get to what may change about 131 or efforts. Things like the Exide site, the 22, 23 Superfund sites in Santa Clara County that were created by the microchip industry. I've heard people supposing, because it's so unclear, that things like nuclear research could come under this advanced manufacturing. It's just such a broad exemption and undefined, who knows what it means. So thank you for providing that illustration and pointing to where things may change. Shall we go, or David, did you want to comment on that at all?
No, I'm good.
Yeah, then to the next slide, which will be for David especially because of the appreciation of how CEQA has changed over time, maybe describing those exemptions on football stadiums and how that's what we're kind of facing in Kern County, et cetera. So what have you seen?
Well, an event happened, what, 15 years ago, Doug, or a couple of events that I think has led to a whole slew of either billionaires who want football and basketball stadiums or other wealthy industrialists running up to Sacramento to get their own, bespoke CEQA exemption and having that work. And I think Doug and I both bear some responsibility for this. Doug's firm, you guys had the Walnut case, right? And
We did.
They beat the city of Walnut. That was also a stadium case, if I remember. They beat them so badly that either the city or the stadium proponents ran to Sacramento and complained, and the legislature very helpfully took that project out of CEQA. And then the project was never built. The next iteration was a billionaire wanted to buy the Rams, the LA Rams, and build a stadium in downtown LA. It's going to be called Farmers Field. And there was a big negotiation in Sacramento over a potential bill to allow that. I participated in that. And to my surprise, a deal was struck that there wasn't a CEQA exemption, but there was sort of a speed up in that. And so that became law. And I helped seal that deal. I was okay with it at the time. It may have been a mistake in retrospect, but that's what happened. And I think that gave a lot of people the idea that, well, if you have enough money, you can go to Sacramento and buy yourself your own CEQA exemption. So we've seen a lot of that happening over and over again, either speed ups or things like I think the Santa Clara Stadium, the Sacramento Stadium for the Kings, the Clippers Stadium, I think, is another one. So if you're a billionaire and you want a new toy, pretty easy in California to get your own personal CEQA exemption for things. And then in more substantively, perhaps, because of the housing crisis in California, there's been a lot of activity in the last few years, much of it involving Scott Wiener, to remove CEQA analysis, particularly from affordable housing, bill after bill, year after year, to the extent that there's not much CEQA left in the affordable housing infill world. And AB 131, which I think we're going to talk about, pretty much ends CEQA coverage for almost all housing that can say without blushing that it's infill or infill adjacent or something like that. CEQA has gone away for that. And there is no proposal that I know of right now to fix or change that. So yeah, there have been lots of changes over time, all of them towards liberalizing CEQA and making it less, in the sense of making it less effective.
Well, it strikes me that, you mentioned the special interest, and everybody kind of knows billionaires have a unwanted, extra pull. That seems the polar opposite of the democratization and the ways it operates to place more essential power and voice in people's hands, where all these special interests are pulling it the other way to taking that power out of it by exempting things from CEQA or getting special treatment or special expeditious litigation, for instance, is some special treatment that billionaires and others are able to get. So thank you for observing that. The slide, by the way, about CEQA myths and facts is a picture of a cover of a Rose Foundation report that addresses how CEQA has been subject to these attacks and criticisms. And a lot of the impetus behind that has been, say, the special interests and the billionaires who want to basically discredit and demolish CEQA piece by piece, or in one broad stroke, as they tried, this last session. So thank you for kind of illustrating that and talking about how CEQA has progressed over time to be this kind of punching bag. I see it as like a Rocky in the boxing movie from the 70s, where it'll take a lot of punches, but I think eventually it's solid and it's going to win. So anything else on this evolution over time, or shall we go to the next slide as well? Okay, because the next slide is more of a continuation about that, but more with specific application to climate goals that we do want to reach, like renewables, wind farms, solar energy. There's myths about CEQA propagated to say that it's created so much red tape and has stopped projects that we can't get anything done. And that's not true. There's been enormous reaches and strides in achieving renewables, but people, the abundance is the latest crowd to do it, have said CEQA has posed barriers that make it insurmountable or too hard to get good renewable projects or things that promote our climate objectives done. And that, of course, is a myth, as we've talked about, that you can have overriding considerations. You have lots of exemptions, including for renewable energy projects. So projects that have not been exempted are the ones that are most damaging to biological resources, like desert tortoise or Native American cultural values. But many projects have been able to go forward. I'd like to, in the interest of time, ask quickly if there's either more comment or observations on this subject area about clean energy and climate, or should we go to, forward a little more? What do you guys think?
I just like to add that there is probably going to be a clean energy CEQA bill introduced in the legislature later this year. And I think that's directly related to the Ezra Klein book and that philosophy that we need to build clean energy faster and faster.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and thank you, David. That's the legislature has come back to that pretty frequently. It is possible to build clean energy to promote it at the same time, not ignoring or shuffling aside the other interests in California. So that's good to know, and I think people, of course, will be watching that bill and being aware of how it plays out to meet multiple goals in California. Shall we go to discussing it? This is essentially more of the same on the next page or next slide. This one specifically focused on warehouses because I found it mildly amusing that SB 607 and then 131, but 607 from Senator Wiener especially exempted warehouses and oil refineries because it was so polluting. Not even he could kind of imagine exempting or treating these projects separately. So Aleja, do you want to talk a little bit about what you've seen with warehouse pollution in communities or how you've approached this area of impact?
Yeah. I'll talk a little about warehouses and then also some of the projects that our communities have been most affected by. And I would say, like, this is a response to the critique that CEQA allows for inaction by creating unnecessary red tape. And I guess my main response that I have to that is that health protections are not unnecessary. Warehouses are extremely polluting. I actually know of a warehouse being proposed to be built right across the street from an elementary school here in Lincoln Heights in LA. And so projects like warehouses are regulated by CEQA because they pose real harms to local communities. And another example that I'm thinking of, it's not a warehouse, but it's the Exide facility here in Vernon in Southeast LA. So that was a lead acid battery recycling plant. And again, we don't know the definition of advanced manufacturing because it is so broad. But at the time, that technology was considered, ahead of its time. So it might have been able to, get under the definition of advanced manufacturing. And now we're seeing with that is that project is the biggest environmental cleanup in California's history, right? And so if you are not being health protective in the beginning, then down the line, it's not about inaction, it's about, health protection. And another thing I also wanted to bring up is a lot of the people that are advocating for CEQA reform are saying things like, look at the states of Florida or Texas who don't have these same hindrances, right? Because they don't have an analogous law like CEQA. And then Texas doesn't have statewide zoning laws. And so we're seeing in real time the ways in which not having these protections and not having this environmental review process can lead to a lot of really detrimental disasters and impacts, like we're seeing with the floods in Texas. And so I would say just to the idea that, CEQA just creates unnecessary red tape for people who are bearing the brunt of the impacts of not considering the environmental impacts. Yeah, I don't think I would call that unnecessary red tape.
And I mean, thank you, Aleja, because everybody, I think, well, most people will acknowledge that the flooding in Texas, the wildfires in California are exacerbated by climate change and made worse and worse every year. And that flooding, the loss of the girls in the camps, that is, I understand, something that was mapped by FEMA to be in the flood zone and was removed from those mappings. So some of that planning that occurred and decisions that were made, years ago or long time that could have predicted what might happen, maybe were considered too much red tape, but that's red tape that protects lives and saves people. An ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure comes to mind. That there's a reason for regulations and regulatory protections. So thank you for reminding us about places that don't have that necessarily, like California does, but that doesn't necessarily mean we want to be like that. Let me ask if we should go, because there's been a lot of discussion of housing and it is such a large part of the conversation. If we might go to the next slide. The housing affordability crisis in California has seemed to have driven the debate and the rationalizations for reforming or scaling back or rolling back CEQA and environmental protections. And I think we wanted to at least touch on the question of is CEQA really at fault there, or is too much blame being laid at the feet of CEQA for the housing affordability crisis? One in which market rate housing seems to be further and further beyond the reach of people who are trying to live in California. I wonder if, David, you'd like to comment a bit about the housing, again, emphasis on affordability, not necessarily just production, but the aspects in California where CEQA has been coming under fire for allegedly stopping the production of housing.
Thanks, Doug. There's one fact that pretty much puts this argument to rest if you think about it for a second. In San Francisco, there are roughly 40,000 fully permitted but unbuilt units. Fully permitted meaning gone through CEQA, got all the permits you need to be able to go pull a building permit and start, but those units haven't been built. And why not? Well, it's not because of CEQA, because by definition, they've already done what they needed to do. So there are obviously other factors involved. I think mostly the cost of construction, um, and local building department red tape. We've all had that experience, um, that are preventing these units from being built. And if you look over the years at CEQA changes, particularly with affordable housing, and to see whether the number of units has increased, I don't think there is any relationship that you can draw from the data that any of the things that, for example, Scott Wiener has promoted over the past, I don't know, 10 years has made any difference in the supply of affordable housing in California. And we talked about a little earlier in AB 130, which was the Trailerville version of the Buffy Wicks housing bill from this session. Pretty much any housing now, not just affordable, if it has some connection to infill, up to 20 acres. 20 acres is going to be exempt from CEQA. So that just blew a big hole in communities' ability to deal with sprawl and displacement and gentrification and the like. But it's now the law, and in the cleanup efforts that are taking place in Sacramento on these bills right now as we speak, there's no effort that I can see going on to try to fix anything in AB 130.
Mhm. I mean, one of the aspects of this housing regulation is that there are certain concerns like the GHG emissions, wildfire hazards that you would hope are considered as people are planning that the siting of housing, whether it's sprawl development or in very high fire hazardous areas. Have you seen much consideration for other policy questions as people are examining like 130?
Yes, and there in 131, AB 131, there is a section on hardening against wildfires that has a bunch of CEQA exemptions for various hardening activities. And it's very sort of factual about how many feet from the house do you need to go out, before CEQA kicks in, that kind of thing. I'm not a wildfire expert, but my take on what happened in 131 is that it made it more difficult to have CEQA review of what communities are doing to make themselves less vulnerable to wildfires.
Well, in wildfires is one of the things that we also wanted to cover. I don't know if it may be good to go to the next slide again with the eye on the clock and wanting to get to questions and answers. There's been cases in which the Attorney General of California has intervened or participated, say in Otay in San Diego or in Clear Lake County, because of this concern about wildfires being a danger to putting siting housing in the urban wildlands interface zone. Again, when there's an effort to sweep aside any regulations to make way for housing anywhere developers want to build, it seems like it might lead to, let's say, unwise siting decisions.
Well, and we saw, Doug, that after the January fires, the governor moved to exempt a whole bunch of fire hardening activities and vegetation management activities from CEQA. And then on the federal side, what's that damn thing called? Something Fix the Forest bill or something that would make it easier to cut timber in the national forests. Although, the LA fires had nothing to do with forest land. This was, chaparral and the local, local vegetation, not forests that burned. But anyhow, the fires have given momentum to people who want to cut down more forest areas for various extraneous reasons.
Yeah, I think you have seen that phenomenon. If you remove all the forests, then there won't be a forest fire. I think
got it all down. It works great.
Well, okay. There's mention on this slide about the Centennial GHG ruling, again, because Climate Action California is particularly attuned, I think, to climate change and greenhouse gas issues. This is a recent Court of Appeal decision that involved the Center for Biological Diversity and California Native Plant Society. The published part of it dealt with how a sprawl project, the Tejon Ranch development, the centennial component of it in North Los Angeles County, kind of misled, no, not kind of misled, they did mislead in the EIR about how greenhouse gas impacts would be dealt with. They tried to say that they were covered by the California cap and trade program. And then for that reason, a lot of mitigation measures did not need to be adopted by the project. The County of LA supervisor said, well, if cap and trade covers it, we don't need to. And the Court of Appeal perceived, and the trial court as well, the Court of Appeal upheld the trial court, that this was misleading to the public to try to claim that greenhouse gas impacts would be mitigated by a program that did not even cover it at all. So I wanted to mention that in a case that also dealt with wildfire impacts, where embers would be carried beyond the project site itself. And it's a very good recent decision, but of course, one that came up during the legislative debate on SB 131 and AB 130. I believe there was a senator possibly named Shannon Grove who kept on saying, well, you know, what about this? And we're going to, you know, price people out of the market. Well, I guess I wanted to mention it because it just illustrates that there are factors that have to be considered other than just the number of units that might get built in a dangerous location. It's now 7:09, about 7:10. We're about 1 minute earlier than on track. I wonder if we might, are we missing anything, Aleja or David, or keep on going to our next set of discussion? Because we also have a lot of comments or questions, I should say. We have a very full, thank you everybody for submitting those questions, and we'll get to them in a moment or two. So thank you for submitting those, and please do keep them coming. Thank you to Linda for collating for us, Linda and Amanda now. Before we get there, though, I wonder if we could go to the next slide and just remind ourselves of the broad depth of the coalition to defend the environment in California. And this isn't even everybody. I mean, this is only something like over 100 groups have submitted letters to the legislature trying to defend CEQA against some of these attacks. The organization CEQA Works involves over 200 groups. I see Climate Action California is down there in the center middle. Center for Biological Diversity, CBE, instrumental to these efforts to defend California's bedrock environmental laws. Not just CEQA, but also the Coastal Act, Clean Air Act, all forms of environmental protection in California. So I wanted to shout out to everybody in the efforts of such a list. I think there are people who are also instrumental in defending CEQA who are not necessarily reflected in this kind of set of logos, which is the tribal Native American community, the very strong and important ally, the labor unions and the labor movement, helping to defend CEQA from their different perspectives, but not necessarily reflected on here, but very important allies in this fight and struggle. I wonder, I mean, Aleja, I know you and I went to lobby in person, you know, back in May 23 when 607 was looking dangerous and still was, and, you know, turned into a different form, into SB 131. I wonder if we could go to the next slide to talk a little bit about, and also invite David to talk about what can be done to, you know, take the rough edges off of 131 and also defend and guard CEQA generally. David, do you want to start with, say, the 131, you know, cleanup?
Sure. As I mentioned, there are efforts to clean up 131 that are underway right now as we speak. And there are two main issues of discussion that people are interested in. One is the habitat area, what counts as endangered habitat for the purposes of not having some of these projects allowed to be there. My friend Kim Delfino is really ramrodding that effort. And then the other is on what the hell is advanced manufacturing anyhow? And what does it mean? There is, I think Aleja mentioned earlier, there's a broad but vague definition in state law. There's a narrower definition under federal law. There's a state agency that has been issuing sales tax rebates to companies that it views as advanced manufacturing for years, and they're just a grab bag of stuff. I think someone asked in the comments, would a data center be advanced manufacturing? I don't know. Nobody knows. When we had a couple of us had a meeting on Monday with Senator Wiener and Senator McGuire, and I asked Senator Wiener, to his face, what does this mean? How do we know what's in and what's out? And he wouldn't look at me or answer. So I don't know what it's going to be. So that needs to get fixed. I mean, everyone needs some degree of certainty, both in the community and, if you're running a business, you need to know, hey, does CEQA apply to my project or not? And as AB 31 is now written, there's really no way to know that. So I have some confidence it's going to be fixed. Whether the fix is something we'll like, I don't know.
And David, one thing about this slide or the recommendations to people was that a lot of the recommendation is to call our elected officials to have them talk to Senator McGuire, not to call Senator McGuire necessarily because he seems pretty supportive
Right.
and strong. But
yeah, Senator McGuire is a champion for our view of what needs to be fixed in 131. He's the pro tem of the Senate. So he swings a lot of weight, but he can't tell Scott Wiener, take that crap out. That's kind of not how it works. So I think what would help Senator McGuire is to have other state senators call him or go see him and say, look, we support you on this. This needs to get fixed. Let's get it done. He told us, well, there's been some staff to staff contact, but there hasn't been a lot of people, eyeball to eyeball saying, look, Senator, I've got your back on this. Let's get it done. So I think it would be very helpful for people to call their state senator and basically say, I need you to go to Senator McGuire and tell him that you support fixing AB 131 and we need to get that done. I think calling Speaker Rivas would be a waste of time at this point because he's basically okay with it. But the action is now with Senator McGuire.
Okay, I mean, thank you, David. And let me ask Aleja as well, because if anybody were to Google Aleja and CEQA in the past week or two, or let's say month, you have a lot of quotes, great quotes in papers as part of this coalition defending CEQA. Well, how's your perception, or what would you see and suggest?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Yeah, I know I've been quoted in a lot of places for some reason lately. Yeah, I would say definitely coming from the community perspective, Doug talked about our lobby day that we had. So we had a bunch of our community members, both adult and our youth members, fly up to Sacramento and lobby against SB 607, and now we're seeing it with 131. And the only thing that I would add with how this really affects our communities is that most of our communities sit right next to land that is zoned industrial. So this advanced manufacturing piece is really, really vital. It's really harmful for our communities. So we're very, very concerned about that. And yeah, I would say if you could definitely, call your representatives and urge them to call McGuire, but also, bringing up the fact about the advanced manufacturing really affecting environmental justice communities and really compounding the environmental burdens that they already are affected with.
Thank you, Aleja. Then I would like to go to the questions and answer, which again, thank you for all your patience to pose those in the chat as we've been going. We'll kind of loop back on some of them will be quick, some of them may be longer. I wonder if either Linda or Amanda, you'd like to come up, or if you'd like me to just go, to the questions and document there.
Yeah.
Hi, Linda.
Yeah, Kate and I have been organizing them and have highlighted the ones we think are the most relevant. We just want to thank everybody who put in questions and comments in the chat. It's been such a rich discussion. And we won't have time to ask all the questions, but we've highlighted the ones we want to really make sure we get to. Just before that, I wanted to comment on this one slide that at Climate Action California, I'm the volunteer coordinator here. We believe in reaching out to everybody in the legislature, whether we think they're going to support us or not, because we do think that does make a difference. So we would say the first priority is to call your senator and ask them to talk to Senator McGuire and urge him to make these fixes. But we also do recommend you ask Senator to call Senator or Speaker Rivas too, and not give up on that, even though it may not pan out the way we hope. We never give up on any of them, and sometimes we've been surprised. So, and then like someone put in the chat, we could also thank Senator McGuire if he's indicated he'd like to make this happen and just give him our support and say, we're behind you. Let us know how we can help. So we do recommend doing this tomorrow morning. They're going to be going on recess at the end of this week. So the sooner they hear the calls, the better. It may be something we have to work on over the 1 month break because it may not happen before then. So we'll have to keep the momentum going. But
And Linda, do you mind if I mention, because some people won't be able to see this, but
Yep.
there's 85 participants. There was over 100 earlier this evening. Like, people who are watching are, in good company. So thank you everybody for coming. But really, really wanted to shout out to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we did send an email blast this morning that had some speaker notes or some started talking points that might be helpful. But let's go on to the Q&A. Thank you again for everybody who put their questions in. Wanted just to lead off with this one. Somebody was hoping to hear a little more about those the problematic aspects of AB 131, and just wonder if you could say a little bit more about the most problematic ones. Um, I mean, we had them in the speaker points, the habitat definition, right, and advanced manufacturing. But is there anything else you could add to like flesh that out before we go to the next question?
David, do you want to take that?
Yeah, there's an issue about tribal rights in 131 and how they're treated or not treated. My understanding from, inside the building, as they say in Sacramento, is that that's getting zero attention and is not a high priority for anybody up there. There's an issue, a very technical issue uh, of interest only to lawyers, really, about what goes in the administrative record, which is the basis for deciding a CEQA lawsuit. Those aren't like you put witnesses on the stand. They're all based on a paper record. And there's some issues with that that might get hashed out, but I'm not sure. The two that people are working hard on are advanced manufacturing and habitat.
And
If I can, oh, sorry. Go ahead,
Leah,
Philip.
you first, Leah.
Okay, I'll be quick. This is just a little thing with it too, and we heard this in the budget committee hearing, is that Scott Wiener was very much like, don't worry, this won't apply to hazardous areas with hazardous waste. And the definition of hazardous waste for 131 is sites on the Cortese list. And as I've seen in my work in Southeast LA and Wilmington, that list is not accurate at all.
Right.
So even though it's purporting to not include hazardous waste sites, I work on so many sites that are not on that list. So it's not encompassing.
Okay. I'm sorry, I wanted to just quickly add on to what David said on the record, which is, I mean, that's a strike and a blow against transparency in California to basically exclude things that are communications between staff at a city and record, and internal communications are a way of opening up government processes to everybody, and this bill has placed those out of reach in terms of CEQA cases, but still can be gotten at through the Public Records Act theoretically. So just wanted to note that. Shall we go to another one, Linda, or shall I choose? Because you're on mute. So
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking of doing the one about attacks on CEQA. I thought this was really interesting that one of the lines of attack against CEQA has been the so-called abuse of CEQA. And how do we address this alleged abuse of CEQA by labor unions who challenge projects under CEQA in order to improve their ability to obtain union jobs? Do you have thoughts about that?
oh, I have thoughts. I don't know if David or Aleja want to go first about that, because what do you guys think?
Well, two quick things. One is I, every area of law has abusive and stupid lawsuits. CEQA is no exception to that. And I'm not talking just, union things. There are, whack jobs who file cases, and industry files CEQA cases against other industries to get an economic advantage, which is not what it's designed for. So CEQA is hardly unique in that sense. And on the labor union issue, my view is if a CEQA issue is legitimate, it doesn't matter who brings it, because it's really the community and, in a sense, the environment itself that profit from CEQA cases. So I'm less concerned, as long as it's a righteous case, if a labor union or a community group brings it. What does concern me is if a labor union brings a case and then agrees to dismiss it if they get a project labor agreement. That makes me upset. And I have told unions, at NRDC, I occasionally worked on cases where there was union involvement. And I told them, you guys need to promise me you're not going to do that or I'm not in. And that's worked out.
That's a great way to put it, David. The righteousness of the case doesn't matter who brings it if it's a righteous case and it's carried forward, through. I have a further comment, but Aleha, any view of this part?
Yeah, just a quick comment. Something that CBE really cares about in a lot of our campaigns is worker safety. And so we're seeing, with the Exide cleanup, we have another like metal recycling facility that's being cleaned up. We're really worried about worker safety. So if CEQA is being used in the way that David was talking about, then of course we support that. And it doesn't really matter who's bringing it. And we are concerned about, the health and safety of the workers that are cleaning up these really contaminated sites and building new projects. And to the other point, something that people were bringing up to us in our lobby day was very much about people abusing CEQA in wealthy neighborhoods because they don't want, mixed use housing and all of that sort of argument. And it was really hard for our community members who are using CEQA just like for the bare minimum health protections in their communities. And so I would just say it feels as if environmental justice communities are sort of the sacrifice zone for this argument. And, the way that we use CEQA is not obviously an abuse. And so it's hard for us to lose the only protection that we have because of this argument that some people abuse it.
This was a very effective part of Lobby Day, Aleha, because it's the baby with the bathwater that when they were kind of talking about reducing CEQA protections for everybody across the board, the hardest hit communities might be the environmental justice communities. There's two cases in particular I know CBE was successful on, suing the city of Richmond over an oil refinery, suing the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Very important cases setting the law for California. And I think unions were instrumental in those alliances and bringing and carrying forward with those cases. So to David's point about the public benefit and the protection of everybody can be promoted by any number of people. So maybe enough on that. If we go to another question. Okay.
Yeah, David had mentioned an expected clean energy CEQA bill in the legislature. So someone was asking if you could tell us a bit more about that, including the best way to stop it.
Oh, I wanted to amend that to improve the bill, not necessarily stop it, but then to you, David.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of details, except I have kind of a schedule, which is soon. And I think this is going to be a very attractive bill to almost everyone in Sacramento. And it's because of the abundance thing and their fear of being, ridiculed by Ezra Klein. And I think it's going to be difficult. Well, I think it'll be impossible to stop in terms of whether it might be modified. This is a weaselly answer, but I kind of need to see it because it depends on what the exemptions look like for the right of way if we're having new transmission lines. How far out from the towers, what kind of habitat are we talking about risking getting trashed? So, and I don't have that text. I haven't seen that yet. I'm guessing at some point over the break that this will get fleshed out and I'll have some text to send around. And then I think we can take a better look at what is most objectionable about it. And whether we'll have a champion, whether Senator McGuire will still be in the game on that topic. I just don't know at this point. I will say that it was very disappointing to see the actions of elected officials that I think we all consider our environmental champions folding like cheap lawn chairs when the vote on AB 131 came around. And I can only hope we don't see that again.
Yeah, so to be continued. It sounds like we need to pay close attention to developments. And I think we'll finish with one more question so we can wrap up at the end on time. But this one I think is especially thoughtful, kind of tying back to this narrative and what's the counter narrative, especially in the context of future legislation that's trying to undo or narrow the Swiss cheese CEQA landscape. How can we change the script to make legislators want to protect CEQA instead of weaken it? How can we help them see the good it does and yeah, have them say, yes, we want housing and we want to protect our environment and communities. Any thoughts about how we can change the narrative as we wrap up?
Again, I have some, but I'd let David or Leha first. David?
I think that my observation has been that what works in the legislature isn't fact or logic, but stories. Stories can be very powerful. Oh, I have a neighbor who had a friend whose community library got stopped because some idiot filed a CEQA case, or their kid went to a daycare that got shut down, something like that. And we have lots of stories that we can tell. I mean, Exide, that Aleha mentioned is one of them. I worked on that case for years, and you could get me ranting about lead poisoning and the dangers to children quickly, and I'm going to spare you that for right now, but it's just an awful, awful thing what happened that could have been prevented if there had been adequate CEQA review. And think we have cases like that in the warehouse cases. And, you know, at NRDC, I had lots of clients who were little girls with asthma inhalers, and I would certainly be shameless enough to bring someone like that to Sacramento and say, see, this is why I'm doing this. What do you think about that? And I think that's the kind of stuff we need to do.
Very powerful. I've heard people not wanting to have golden inhalers. In other words, don't let the pollution happen and then mitigate it with a, gold inhaler, prevent the pollution in the first place. My thought on what you can do when you change CEQA is you're either going to be promoting environmental protection and public participation, or you're going to be going in the opposite direction. And so people and legislature should want to protect the public, and they should want to promote democracy, because doing anything going in the other direction is anti-democratic and it's damaging and harmful to communities.
Wow, what a powerful note. Aleha, do you want to add one last thought, or should we wrap up there? That was terrific. Yeah, I think
all of that.
Yeah, and stories are really true. That is really moving to people. So great. Well, we want to just finish up here. We're at the bottom of the hour. Maybe go to the next and final slide. First, I just want to thank all of our speakers tonight, Doug, Aleha, and David. You guys put a lot of effort into preparing this and thinking through everything to cover. There was a lot to cover. We could have gone on much longer, and just appreciate all the time and wisdom, expertise you shared with us. And I also want to thank this team behind the scenes, Wendy, Climate Action California's Natural Resources co-chair, and Kate, who's been helping collect questions in the chat and organize them, and Amanda, and our CEO, Janet. Just appreciate the partnership we've had on this webinar, and especially to everybody who came tonight and those who helped promote the webinar to others. We got a great turnout. So thank you all. Please also share your feedback on this webinar with us. There's a QR code you can see there, and I will also drop into the chat a direct link. Actually, maybe Amanda, you could put that in the chat for those who don't want to scan the QR code. But if you could just take 1 or 2 minutes now while it's on top of your mind to answer a few questions about how this webinar was for you, what you liked, how we can improve, we really appreciate that. And again, please don't forget to take action. There is if all of us who came tonight call tomorrow, we can make some significant movement in the Capitol on getting this on their dials. So please do make those calls and invite others to make the calls. We're all in this together, and we need everybody to pitch in. And last but not least, we also encourage you to get involved with Climate Action California. We're all volunteer run, and so As a volunteer coordinator, my role is just to help you find a way to volunteer. So if you would like to participate, you just go to climateactionca.org and fill out the volunteer form, and we'd love to have you get involved. So with that, any final questions or comments, Doug, you'd like to make?
Oh, I'd like to close it with a thank you to you, Linda, and Climate Action California, but also especially Aleha David. Thank you for recognizing the time it was taken in care to curate the comments and really appreciate that. I want to give a my visible clap to you guys, Aleha David, and thank you for the time and this evening and everybody coming to it.
All right. Well, with that, we'll wrap up, and thanks again, everybody. Have a good night.